Voters pay attention to party leaders and to their own ridings, but our Northwestern and Eastern Ontario Hub's journalists would like to draw your attention to two additional races to watch. Here for that, in our studio at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Claude Sharma covering the Northeast, and in our studio at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, David Rockney-Corrigan covering Eastern Ontario. Welcome. Now, I want to start with you, David. You have an article on tvo.org about Peterborough-Kawartha lakes. What do people need to know about that?
So the riding is Peterborough-Kawartha. It is a riding formerly known as Peterborough. Basically, in this election with the redistribution, it added a little bit of some of the townships around and chopped off some of the others, but it's essentially Peterborough, the city, and the surrounding townships. The riding is a population of roughly 110,000.
Now, your article looks at why some people think Peterborough is Ontario's bellwether riding. Tell me about that.
Sure. So it's quite an interesting thing that's happened in Peterborough over the last 40 years. So beginning in 1977, Peterborough has voted for the party that ended up forming government in every single election going back to 1977. That's a pretty remarkable feat. If you talk to people who watch these kinds of things, they'll say it's something that's quite extraordinary, actually. So that's 11 straight elections in which Peterborough has voted for the party that ended up forming government. So it's gotten this sort of moniker as being a bit of a bellwether riding.
1977. There has to be some theories behind that.
So there are, and that's really, I mean, some people might say that Peterboroughians, or Borowians, I guess they're called, are, psychic, but, that's not serious. I think there are some theories that people have posited over the years. I spoke to a historian who had some theories that were actually going back a couple of hundred years, saying that the religious makeup of Peterborough was actually pretty diverse, and it was sort of a cross-section of the province, basically hitting on the provincial average in terms of makeup. And then if you sort of go forward into more modern times, I spoke to a fellow, David Goyette, who's a columnist in Peterborough, and he talked about a couple of different things. One of them being the sort of relative geographic isolation in Peterborough. So, unlike some of the places like Burlington or Hamilton, there aren't really these sort of an exaggerated influence by neighboring communities. So that isolation combined with a very robust media, there are like 7 radio stations, a couple of newspapers, and a handful of independent media outlets. That combined with the isolation, combined with a sort of a conversation that generally happens politically around leaders as opposed to local issues. And then you've got this sort of average city Ontario. If you think about Peterborough, you've got, at the same time, it's a university town. It's also, it's got a thriving cultural scene. It's got a strong rural population. It's got a city population. It's also part of cottage country. It's sort of this interesting cross-section of Ontario living. So you combine all those forces and you've sort of got average city Ontario, and I think that may be contributed to why Peterborough has sort of been on the prescient side of elections.
Claude, I want to turn to you. You also have an article for coming up on tvo.org about a riding that probably no one has heard about. Tell me about, or what do people need to know about Mushkegowuk-James Bay?
Well, first, let's talk about the Far North Electoral Boundaries Commission, a commission appointed by the Liberal government a few years back. And its goal was to create 2 new ridings in the Far North, ridings that would better represent the people who live there, giving a focus on the minorities. And going even a little bit farther back than that, First Nation community leaders, they voiced their concern, saying, you know what, the North needs to be better represented. It needs to be divided up a little bit more so there's more voices at Queen's Park. So what the commission did was create 2 new ridings, starting off in the northwest. Kenora-Rainy River, the northern part of it, is now known as Kiiwetinoong, which will be the first Indigenous majority riding in the province. And going back to the question you asked about Mushkegowuk-James Bay, well, that is carved up from the former Timmins James Bay. So Timmins is now its standalone riding. And north of that, in a much bigger area, is Mushkegowuk-James Bay. And this gave you some of the demographics. The population, only 30,000 people in what is the second biggest riding land-wise in the province. The majority will be Francophones at about 60% and 27% being Indigenous. And some of the cities that people might have heard of that dot the landscape of Mushkegowuk-James Bay include Kapuskasing, Moonbeam, Hearst, and some of the more known First Nation communities include Attawapiskat and Moose Cree.
Now, you touched on the Francophone representation. Now, this riding was to create that Francophone representation, but tell me about how that was formed. How is it going over with the people in that riding?
Well, obviously, the Francophone population is happy. Francophone organizations say this gives them a much-needed voice in the legislature. And I spoke to one Francophone who told me, you know what, this is the start of something special. It's about time they are represented. But that's not the case for everybody. Speaking to NDP Gilles Bisson, who was the member of provincial parliament in the former Timmins James Bay since it was first contested back in 1999, he says the government really dropped the ball on this. They had an opportunity to do something special to create a second Indigenous majority riding, but they failed to do so. So he's not alone on that. I also spoke to Grand Chief Jonathan Solomon of the Mushkegowuk Council, and the Mushkegowuk Council is a senior representative of First Nation communities in the north and northeast, and he said this was simply a process that was too rushed and not done with proper consultation. He said his people, he finds First Nation people weren't really consulted on this, and this should have been pushed to the next election. This decision would have been better made, not this time around, but the next provincial election.
So let's talk about the candidates on the ground there. Are there any favorites in that riding, Claude?
Well, let's go with the main candidates. I call them the main candidates because they're bilingual, and they just were at the Kapuskasing all-French debate earlier this week. So I'll start off with PC's André Robichaud. He is a consultant. He owns his own consulting firm, and he actually ran for the Conservatives in the last federal election. Then there's the NDP, Guy Bourgoin. He is a president of a steel workers association, and he's also of Métis descent. And then there's the Liberals, Gaétan Baillargeon. He is from Constance Lake First Nation, which is by Hearst, and he works in the trucking and forestry industry. And also, three other candidates include a Green Party, a Libertarian, and one from the Northern Ontario Party.
All right, David, quickly tell me who is also running in the Peterborough-Kawartha Lakes riding? Peterborough
has voted governments in, basically. They voted with the party that forms government. So as you can imagine, the Liberals have been held the seat there for the last 15 years. It's a fellow named Jeff Leal. He was previously a city councillor. He tells me that he's actually been in public office for 33 straight years. The PC candidate is a newcomer, if you will. Dave Smith is his name, better known in the community actually for hockey and community hockey. And I've been told, I spoke with Lois Tuffin, who's the editor-in-chief of Peterborough this week, and it does seem as though it'll be a race really between these two candidates. The NDP candidate, Sean Conway, a young man from Curve Lake First Nation. He's a singer-songwriter and a bartender. Some people have expressed concern that, you know, maybe his inexperience might put him at a disadvantage, but really this is about an incumbent, Jeff Leal, who's running again and wants to win the seat. And who knows, it could be a predictor, what happens in this riding, a predictor for the rest of the province.
All right, so this is a question for both of you guys. We'll start with David. Tell me very quickly some of the issues that people are talking about in your ridings.
It's interesting. I mentioned earlier that the community is, you know, really focused on leaders and bigger picture issues. So, you know, given that it's somewhat of a cross section of Ontario, some of the issues that you know that you're hearing about generally, the bigger picture issues like healthcare, like hydro rates. These are big in the community. You know, there are a couple of other more local issues, but it does seem that, you know, some of the issues that we'd be hearing about on a daily basis, and that a lot of the leaders are talking about, again, healthcare, education, mental health, healthcare. These seem to be the issues that are driving the conversation in Peterborough.
Claude, let's talk about some of those key issues that are facing the people in your riding.
Well, some similar ones to the rest of the North and Northeast, bringing back the Northlander, which is the passenger rail service that goes from Timmins to Cochrane, Cochrane to Toronto, Toronto to Cochrane, bringing that back or keeping it on the shelf. Also, hydro rates, healthcare, education, but some more specific to Mushkegowuk-James Bay would include the Endangered Species Act. Where will the next government or the current government go if elected moving forward? Also, bringing more French services in areas, especially in the healthcare sector and hospitals, and also to building, maintaining, and developing stronger relationships with First Nation communities.
All right, guys, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Definitely two ridings we will be keeping our eyes on during the election. Thanks again.
Thanks, Jan.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.